Hello and welcome to the Third Sector podcast. I'm Lucinda Rouse.
And I'm Emily Harle. Each week we bring you half an hour of discussion and debate about the important goings-on in the charity world. This week we'll be focusing on corporate partnerships. And later in Charity Changed My Life, we'll hear how a Swarovski Foundation programme has supported a young person's renewable energy startup in Nigeria.
But going straight into our main discussion this week, the self-proclaimed business and society advisory firm C&E Advisory published its annual corporate non-profit partnerships Barometer last month. This is the 15th edition of the Barometer and is built on the views of 120 companies and non-profits. As you might expect, the top-line motivations behind partnerships remain consistent with previous years. For charities, it's mainly about access to funds, while corporates are looking to enhance their reputation and credibility. But there have been a couple of interesting developments, such as companies' desire to access knowledge becoming an increasingly important motivator. So today we're going to look into the likely future for the world of corporate partnerships based on these findings and find out how charities can best position themselves in response to the changing trends. And we're delighted to be joined for this discussion by C&E Advisory's Chief Executive, Manny Amadi. Hi, Manny.
Hi, Lucinda. Hi, Emily. Great to be here.
Well, it's great to have you with us, I believe, for the third time on this podcast. So before we get into the findings specifically around corporate partnerships, I understand that in the creation of this report, you adopted a slightly different approach this year in the form of a new co-author. Could you tell us briefly about that?
We did. Well, you will know that AI and particularly generative AI is very much in the media, in the news quite a lot. So last year, for the first time as a special topic in the Barometer report, we asked about the likely impact of AI on partnerships and partnering. We also followed up again on this year in the report. And we thought, actually, whilst doing that, why wouldn't we do a real life experiment using AI as a co-author of the report? So that's what we did. And it was a very interesting experience that we had.
Please tell us about the experience.
The main thing was to try and get AI to help us with, obviously, the authorship of the report. But also, because this was the 15th edition of the report, we wanted to look back. So we did a sort of a review of the previous 14 years to get a sense of, themes and then to project forward to see what the future might look like in cross-sector partnering between companies and non-profits. We learned a number of things. We learned that some of the hype around AI is to be believed. So it did some things really very well, like impressively well. So for instance, data analysis, it could suck up a ton of data really quickly. So for instance, look at the last 14 years, gather data, analyze it, and so on. That was immensely powerful. It was also very good at emulating style and tone of voice. So the Barometer, of course, over the years has developed a very particular style. So it did that incredibly well and like scarily well. And then thirdly, it was a good collaborative partner, actually, in the sense that it's almost like you could dialogue with AI and improve as you went along. So some really, really good things. In particular, actually, crunching data from 14 years previously, analyzing it, highlighting themes and so on. So those are really fantastic things that it did.
That all sounds very positive. Were there any downsides to this new AI co-author, and what kind of words of caution would you share with anybody considering doing something similar?
Yeah, so my colleague and others actually have described AI almost like the world's, it's said to be like the world's smartest intern, right? So like interns, they can make amazing discoveries and be brilliant 1 minute, but they can also make mistakes and so on. I suppose, humans do as well. But there were sort of several things that were big watch outs, and we'd advise anyone using AI to look out for them. So one was that it lacked contextual understanding, and maybe that's understandable. So, the nuances and so on that human beings have, computers, AI, and tech don't quite have. And so that was a limitation. So we did have to prompt quite a lot, sit alongside it, and so on to give it that contextual understanding. So that was a bit of a limitation. But the other two things were really surprising. So the second is, you might be familiar with the phrase hallucination. So when tech and AI just make up stuff. And that's really surprising when that happens. So it literally sometimes can just make up stuff. And what's worse is not only does it make up stuff, but it shares it with great confidence. So so if you're not aware that that's happened, you might be really blindsided. So, anyone trying to use AI and so on should go in with their eyes open and stay very close to facts and so on. So we kept asking, where's the evidence for this and so on? And rather than actually make changes, it would often dig in and try to justify its position. So it's a really bizarre, odd thing to watch out for. And then the third thing, which was closely related, was also that it kept overemphasizing the power of technology, which is really curious. So because we've had the experience of 14 years of this report, we know what's right and what's wrong for the most part, right? But often AI and the bots, so to speak, would often kind of highlight digital and tech as being really important themes when that wasn't always the case. So those are just three watch outs.
So an intern biased towards the world of tech who needs strong micromanagement and look out for hallucinations.
Yes, very much so. Having said that, though, on the upside, as I said, you can take on a ton of work, do things incredibly quickly, etc. So it can be helpful.
And moving on from the practice of actually writing the report, we want to dig in a bit to the findings. So a main focus of the report was on the new due diligence regulations that are going to be brought in by the EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive next year. And I was wondering if you can just explain to us a little bit about how this is likely to affect corporate partnerships going forward, both in the immediate future and in the longer term.
Yes, so that was sort of one of the focus topics for this year's report. So the directive essentially encourages or requires large companies trading across the EU to be more explicit about the way in which they report their social and environmental impact. So there's a sort of a double materiality requirement, so that they're obliged to report not just about the likely impact of things like climate change on their businesses and so on, but also their own impact on social and environmental issues and so on. It's already in place, but the first reports are due to come out in 2025. So that's when companies are obliged to start their reporting, so in January next year. And what we found was that although the directive was aimed very much at companies, it will impact, of course, charities in many ways. So companies and charity respondents to the survey that we did, so we had about over 120 companies and non-profits from different parts of the world, including the UK, respond to the survey that informed the report. Many of them, I think well over 80%, believe that the directives and related regulations and so on will impact the way in which they partner and will impact non-profits and charities. So those impacts include, for instance, that companies would now require more their charity partners, particularly their strategic partners, to take on a much more holistic approach to their own environmental, social, and governance activities. So having very clear frameworks around that, reporting on actually how they impact and are impacted by social and environmental issues and so on. So that might mean social non-profits, it might be a mental health charity, or it might be a cancer charity and so on, having also to demonstrate and report on how it impacts the risks of environmental issues on its own practices and so on. So that's a change, that's an evolution. So charities are maybe beginning to do that, but those in partnership will be increasingly required to take steps and take actions and demonstrate that they're doing so as a part of that.
So just going back a step on that, this is going to affect any company that has any form of trading with members of the European Union. Is that correct?
At the moment, it's focused on large companies. So if you think about, FTSE 100 to FTSE 250 companies, those sort of sizes of companies and so on, doing business in Europe, so trading in Europe and so on. In time, it will affect SMEs. So 3 or 4 years down the line, it's set to. But it's starting with the bigger companies. So those bigger companies who are often in partnerships with charities and so on are in turn making requirements, or are likely to make requirements of their charity partners as well.
So presumably that is then going to be moving away from an already quite low level of unrestricted funds given to charities by their corporate partners if they've got all of these additional obligations to fulfill through this directive.
So the report tells us that's likely to happen. So the impacts include, as I've already mentioned, charities being more transparent and doing more about their own environmental, social, and governance reporting activities. Disclosure impacts on them increasing and so on. But one of the things we also did do was to also ask about how and whether or not the changes will affect companies, the modality through which the ways that companies fund their charity partners and partnerships and so on. And yes, what we found was that it seems that companies will be more likely to require clear restrictions and reporting requirements on the funds that they provide to their charity partners. So they're more likely, more inclined to provide earmarked or maybe even tightly earmarked rather than unrestricted or flexible funding to their charity partners. And we found that's also something quite interesting. This was one of the areas in the report where we found quite a big gap between companies' expectations and what charities are expecting as well. So that's maybe something to maybe explore.
And that's really interesting that you found that such huge gap between expectations. How can charities work to address that, especially when unrestricted funding is so valued by the sector?
Unrestricted funding is, very much valued by the sector for reasons that I think we all know, because of course it allows charities to put funding where they believe it's most needed. They are experts who understand issues, they're closer to the issues, etc. And if they're restricted to projects and so on that perhaps are not the top priorities for them, then that in a sense reduces their ability to deliver and fulfill their mission, right? Our sense, when we dug a little more deeply in this, was that the reaction or likely reaction by companies is a little bit knee-jerk, because actually the directive allows them scope to do more than some of them are inclined to do. So the advice to charities is that they should have meaningful discussions with their corporate partners to inform them, enable them to make informed decisions they make about funding. Charities need to much better make the case for flexible funding, unearmarked funding, and so on. Because, of course, when you do that, companies reduce the transactional cost, if you like. So every time a charity has to report on, its programs or programming and so on, and doing it over and over and over again for different partners and so on, each time that costs them obviously time and money and so on. So it's ironic because what it then does is, in a sense, it's inefficient, right? And of course, companies are very interested in efficiency and in seeing their funding actually used to achieve results and so on. So there's a lot of work for charities to do. Maybe this is a wake-up call for them to begin to have these conversations. There are charities and non-profits and international organizations that are doing that and doing that really well. There is a place for really good impact reporting as well. So charities need to also pay attention to that, I would suggest.
So moving on to another area of the report, we've already spoken about your use of artificial intelligence in generating and co-authoring this report, but how about the use of AI in partnerships? I know that it is something that you've covered in previous barometers, but based on this year's findings, how do you see usage of AI likely to evolve, and how can charities best position themselves for the evolving AI landscape when it comes to their corporate partnerships?
Use the word evolve, Lucinda. I think you probably used it advisedly. So it will be an evolution rather than a revolution. So last year, for the first time, we asked a question about use of AI in partnerships. And what we found then was that about 20% of respondents, so charities and companies, anticipated deploying AI in their partnerships in some way. This year, that has gone up actually to about a third. Well, precisely a third, actually, of companies and nonprofits saying they'll be using AI in their partnerships in the coming year. So it's quite an increase. But it's not as dramatic an increase as we had anticipated because, when you think about all the things that are around AI as a topic and so on. So it will be an evolution rather than revolution, we think. And when we do the report again next year, we expect that figure to have increased. Charities and companies expect in the main to use AI around things like impact reporting and also around research and researching and so on in their partnerships. Those are potentially important areas where charities can deploy AI. In terms of how they could put themselves in a good position, there's often a mental block, I think, for some organizations, not just charities, and the companies included and so on, and government departments and others and so on around technology and AI. So there's something about the kind of a psychological and mental shift. So these tools can really help us become more effective, more efficient, and so on. and we should embrace them, but embrace them advisedly for the reasons I mentioned previously. There's also something about then organizations and charities training themselves into how to best use tools like AI, and in doing so, also making sure they put important guardrails around themselves, because we've seen, as I mentioned before, AI is not always 100% correct. So there's something about obviously checking and checking homework and reviewing outputs and all of that sort of stuff. So those are quite important things. So essentially, the message there will be trust but verify whatever kind of you get from as an output from AI. So it can be very, very useful. So it can save charities a lot of time. So we use it for research, and we know the charities that are doing so, for instance. And if you're doing prospect research, if you're looking at which companies you approach, or if you're looking at understanding the context and the issues that are affecting your potential partner and so on, those can be quite important tools to use.
So the two areas that we've just discussed are pretty forward-looking in terms of this new EU directive that has already come in but is likely to take effect and have an impact on how corporates treat their charity partnerships in the coming year or two or three, and also obviously the evolving nature of the use of AI. What should charities, corporate partnership teams be anticipating for the coming years?
There's been an evolution over the last 14 years or so, or 5 years. So partnerships, when we started the Barometer series, were very much more philanthropic. They were more transactional. They were more short term, and so on. Those things haven't gone away. So there are still, when I talk mostly about sort of strategic partnerships between companies and charities. But actually, philanthropic short-term partnerships still remain, and they will remain, because, for instance, in humanitarian emergencies and so on, companies will support and engage. In the pandemic, they did so too, to support kind of their local communities and so on. So that will continue. But there's a clear evolution that has happened. Partnerships have become, of course, more long-term, more strategic, and so on. So look into the future. I think, back to that word evolution, that evolution will continue. So the trend will include things like a sort of deeper integration of environmental, social, and governance issues and so on. So as companies embed those topics within, this at the center of actually how they do business and so on, partnerships, one route in which they support those activities and so on. So that integration, I think, will be a kind of a core trend going forward. That then supports the idea of also a focus on resilience and long-term thinking. So that's very, very much a trend. So if you think about the charities that won the partnerships that are the most admired, they tend to be long-term partnerships. And the third thing will be about multi-stakeholder partnerships. I think there is this realization that no single actor, no single organization can on its own solve the issues facing us, whether it's cancer or climate change or those sorts of issues and so on. And increasingly, collaboration is an important thing. So you get, for instance, Coca-Cola and Pepsi, for instance, sworn enemies commercially, collaborating and partnering on things like water, for instance. And I think that theme and that trend will continue going forward.
And have you seen any sort of gold standard partnerships over the past year or so working in these areas? So partnerships where there's multi-partners or who are doing that long-term resilient thinking really well? So
one of the things we do is, in the report, we ask respondents, and this is unprompted, which are the partnerships you most admire and why. And last year and this year, the most admired partnership was the one between Tesco and 3 charities, so British Heart Foundation, Cancer Research UK, and Diabetes UK. So it's a sort of a health partnership. They're working together to improve the nation's health and well-being and so on, to get people to take active steps to prevent those conditions, working with, I think, 300,000 Tesco employees and so on. So they're doing all of that. It's a long-standing partner. It's a long-term partnership addressing very serious issues, and they're working strategically. They're very mission-focused, but the partnership has also raised, and forgive me if I get this figure wrong, at least £18 million across the last few years for those partners. So fundraising's all at the heart of it. It supports fundraising, I should say, but at the heart of it, they kind of the issues and the causes that those organizations support. And then partnerships are also evolving. Another example would be, Tesco again, and their partnership with WWF. So that's a partnership where they came together to try and, committed to halve the environmental footprint of the average shopping basket in the UK. Now, that started off as a bilateral partnership between those two organizations. But it's now evolved, and so WWF has convened now many of the supermarkets in the UK. So at least seven of the biggest supermarkets in the UK are now involved in that. Again, that same notion of we can't on our own singly address these issues. So those partnerships are about climate, they're about deforestation or tackling deforestation, and they're about improving the environment and so on. So yes, there's some sort of trends that we're seeing around that.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear that companies are willing to collaborate with the competition in this area, perhaps more so than they would in many others. Just going back to this increased focus on ESG, environmental, social governance issues in the partnerships, do you think that is going to lead companies to favour certain charitable cause areas over others and mean that some charities which perhaps don't easily fit within that ESG bracket might be dropped?
Yes and no. I think my instinct was to say no to your question, Lucinda, because ESG is a very, very broad agenda. Obviously, environmental, social, and governance literally covers everything, right? Social and the environment. So all organizations sort of fall within that. And I think, yes, the yes part comes in when you think about, I think the requirement increasingly, the demand is whether you're a socially focused charity, trying to address poverty, for instance, or not, you have an impact on the environment in some way, or the environmental and climate change that affects you and the people you're trying to support, an organization is trying to support. So there's something about, therefore, having a holistic view of all of those topics that are relevant and are impacting the people you support, and also actually mitigating your own risk. So if you're, flying lots of people to the parts of the developing economies, the developing world, and so on, do your due diligence, for instance, then there are sort of climate risks and challenges there. So being conscious of that and mitigating those sort of actions are necessary and important. And I think where you may be right with the question is that if charities and non-profits are not doing that, because companies and indeed charities are increasingly required to report on, so their scope 3, for instance, impacts on the climate side, they will be increasingly looking at those who they're partnering with, their suppliers and so on, and how they're dealing with climate-related issues and so on. So those who are not engaging or taking seriously that agenda, yes, will put themselves in a position of disadvantage in time. And that may be happening already, but it will likely increase over time. So I think it's a wake-up call, actually, for charities, not just for those in partnership, but actually for particularly boards and CEOs and leadership, sort of groups and so on within charities. The landscape is changing.
Well, you've raised some really important points there, Manny. We will include the link to your barometer in the show notes to this episode. But thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. No, you're welcome.
We hope you enjoyed our discussion with Manny. And now we move on to Charity Changed My Life, in which we bring you the stories of people whose lives have been transformed for the better thanks to the work of charities. This week, we hear from the founder of Light Ed, a renewable energy startup in Nigeria. And he's going to tell us how his enrolment on a program with the Swarovski Foundation has supported him in his quest to solve the problem of energy poverty.
My name is Stanley Anigbogu. I am from Nigeria. I'm a creative technologist and a product designer. Super excited to share my company called Light Ed. We recycle electronic and plastic waste to build solar products for rural communities in Nigeria. We are just young people that really wanted to solve a global problem, which is energy poverty. But at the same time, we wanted to be able to solve a problem that we grew up with, which is using candles and kerosene lamps to study. I came in contact with the Swarovski Foundation through the Creatives for Our Future program, which is an 8-month program that connects young creatives to tackle climate change using creativity and gain access to mentorship at the same time, while having access to a 20,000 euros fund. That funding played a very huge role in supporting the work we are doing in terms of capacity building, in terms of material sourcing, and in terms of impact as well. The mentorship was very interesting because every month we had to meet really amazing industrial experts, sharing their experience, their struggles, and their impact We got inspired. We got amazing ideas. We got people to tell us what we are doing right and what we could do better. One thing that stood out for me specifically was sustainable design doesn't have to be ugly. It has to be able to be marketable, feasible, and a viable solution as well. If I hadn't come in contact with the Swarovski Foundation, I don't think we would have been able to raise more additional funding. Most of the funding and donation we got in 2024 were due to the projects that we were able to do through the Creative for Our Future program, and also the learnings that I picked up from that program on how to engage with funders, how to engage with donors. So honestly, I know it was a very pivotal moment for the work I do as a creative, but also for the work we do in my organization as well.
That was Stanley explaining how Swarovski Foundation's Creatives for Our Future programme has helped him grow his renewable energy initiative. And if you'd like your organisation to be featured in Charity Changed My Life, we'd love to hear from you. All it takes is a short voice message from someone who has benefited from your services. You can find details of how to get in touch in the show notes to this episode.
That's it for this week. We'll be back again next week to follow a day in the life of a head of philanthropy. As ever, if you'd like to get in touch with us with any comments or suggestions for future episodes, please do fill in the survey, which is linked in the show notes to this episode. It will take you a maximum of 5 minutes, I would think. But for now, thank you to our guest, Manny Amadi. Our producer is Nav Pal.